My name is Courtney, and welcome. Today we're going to have Michael Bach talking about supported decision making. Before we get started, I just have a couple of slides, just some housekeeping stuff, and then I'll hand it over to Michael. So, like I said, just a few housekeeping. First, I'll ask that everybody mutes their mic just to block any outside noise that might be happening. If you do need closed captioning, there's a button there in the bottom of the screen. There's like a black bar at the bottom. You can access closed captioning through that. If you have any questions or comments, you can go ahead and put them in the chat, and we'll have some time at the end of the presentation to discuss those. And just so everybody is aware, the session is being recorded, and the session will also be posted to YouTube, just in case anybody's not able to come today. That way they also have access. So before we get started, I also just wanted to do a land acknowledgement before I hand it over to Michael. So we respectfully acknowledge that the lands on which we live, work, and meet are situated on the traditional territories of the Indigenous groups of Newfoundland and Labrador, and we acknowledge with respect the diverse histories and cultures of the Beothuk, Mi'kmaq, Innu, and Inuit of this province. We honor the diverse Indigenous peoples who have cared for this land for past generations and for 7 generations to come. We are committed to listening, learning, and working in collaboration with Indigenous communities as we move towards reconciliation, respect, and mutual understanding. Let us carry this acknowledgement forward in our work and relationships as we strive to create a future that respects and embraces the wisdom of older adults and the diversity of all communities. So before I hand it over to Michael, just a little bit about him, and Michael, feel free to add to it once I hand it on over. But Michael has 35
But
plus
there's
years of
one out there to
research development and advocacy experience in Canada and
yeah, it
internationally
is,
on advancing
Amanda.
inclusion
I'm
and
not
human
taking
rights of
anything.
persons with intellectual and other
Yeah,
disabilities.
yeah, I
His
know.
research and
So
publications
anyway, you
cover
all ready?
disability theory and practice. I will just ask really quickly as well that everybody mute their mics there. I'm getting a little tiny bit of a background noise there. So if everyone could just press that mute button, that'd be perfect. Um, Let's see. Oh, a primary focus of his research and development is on legal capacity and supported decision making and the right to decide. He holds a PhD in sociology and equity studies from the University of Toronto. So, with that, Michael, I'm going to hand it on over to you. So, I will stop sharing and then you can pull on up your slides.
Terrific. Thank you, Courtney. Hello, good morning, everybody. Great to be connecting with you. Familiar faces, and huge thanks to Mary Ennis for reaching out and inviting me to join this group, which I know meets regularly. And Mary and I have known each other for many, many, many years, around many, many, many tables. And it's always a great pleasure to be around the table in Newfoundland and Labrador. So I'm going to share a bit of a presentation and initiate a conversation, take further a conversation that I know has been going on in the province for many, many years on supported decision making, on the right to decide, on how to think about supporting people to have greater control in their lives. And I know this is part of a whole cluster of conversations that are going on in the province as you try to move forward an agenda to address a whole set of issues that are affecting people, seniors, people with disabilities, people with mental health issues. And the right to decide and legal capacity, I think, is an important piece of that puzzle. And so today's an opportunity to dive in a bit deeper to that. And I think it's a timely conversation given work the province has underway. And we'll come back to that. And maybe what some next steps are. I'll share a few slides, some thinking, some of which was shared at the symposium that the steering committee on full citizenship and legal capacity hosted at the end of October in St. John's, but oriented a little more directly to the concerns and the issues that seniors are facing in the province. So I'm going to share my screen, and I'm going to plan to talk for kind of a 20 minutes to half hour-ish, and then we'll open it up to the group. But also if you've got questions, maybe just Courtney, are you going to be tracking the and Mary tracking the chat. Happy.
Yes.
Let's keep this really flexible. If there's something you want to ask as we go, jump in and we can open it up. Let's keep it informal. Okay, slideshow from the beginning. All right, my screen is up. You can see me. See my slides?
Yep,
Courtney,
we
are
can
we
see
up?
them.
Yes.
Yep, you're all good.
Okay, great,
Yeah.
great. Okay. So this this presentation draws from a study that we've recently completed, about to be published, undertaken by myself and Lana Kersner, who's a lawyer, barrister, and solicitor, and you may have met her at various gatherings, most recently at the symposium end of October, where we have looked at the legal capacity laws across the country, provinces and territories. It also, and at the federal level, it also draws on a report that the Institute used to be known as IRIS, name has changed to New Society Institute, that we did a couple of years ago in Newfoundland and Labrador, on supported decision-making roadmap for reform. So this presentation, the roadmap for reform study, as well as this study, which is called Failing at the Gateways to Legal Capacity, because when we did this kind of very systematic assessment of laws and policies in each province and territory at the federal level, you just see how they really are failing to support people to exercise their right to decide. That study, the most recent study, really focused on the legal framework, law and policy to some extent. The earlier study, roadmap supported decision-making roadmap to reform, a couple of years ago in Newfoundland and Labrador, focused partly on the sort of law and policy level, but also on the community practice level. What's needed at the community level to support people to exercise their right to decide. And so we'll be, and I'll be drawing on that a little as well. Just in terms of an outline, we'll start with just to kind of, and this won't be news to anybody, the current context in Newfoundland and Labrador for achieving the right to legal capacity, or what we sometimes refer to as the right to decide, or more commonly, rather, refer to as the right to decide. We'll look at legal capacity laws, what they are, what they do, how we need to redesign those to ensure that people aren't discriminated against, and our assessment of the current framework. But as I say, I'll be drawing, not just looking at the legal framework, but also on the practice and community framework as we go. So what's the current situation? Again, this won't be news, but just to kind of ground what we're kind of where we are. So seniors in NL, they're the fastest growing demographic kind of group of the population. It's a fast increasing population, growing from 19% of the provincial population to 24%, so almost a quarter. And in a few years, if not already, Newfoundland and Labrador are expected to have the largest proportion of seniors of any jurisdiction in Canada. And seniors are getting older, living longer, which means that people are increasingly likely to have some form of cognitive disability, which is associated with aging, dementias, Alzheimer's, etc. In addition to other forms of disability associated with changes in mobility, etc. There's, I would say, worrying signs, and they're outlined in the report, that seniors lack choice, power, and control in their lives, and those are outlined in the Seniors Report 2024 that came out in December from the Office of the Seniors Advocate, Newfoundland and Labrador. and some other sources. And that report draws on the available data to find that abuse and neglect are increasing, and that as the report quotes, crimes against seniors are increasing at an alarming rate. Use of restraints, chemical and otherwise, and the what's referred to as in the report as potentially inappropriate use of antipsychotics in long-term care is higher in Newfoundland and Labrador than the national average. Newfoundland and Labrador seniors have the lowest median income in the country. So that's the income at which the income level at which 50% of seniors fall below that median point or middle point. There's demonstrated lack of community-based and home support services. There's a high demand for long-term care, largely because of the lack of community support. High rates of clinical depression and concerns about social isolation, loneliness, lack of personal and social support. This doesn't mean that everybody is in this situation, but the trends are concerning, and the numbers are concerning. And as I said, no news to the group on this call. That's largely due to lack of home-based personal support, community support. So what does it take to get to gain greater choice, power, and control in a person's life? What does it take? So from various sources of research, I kind of identify, and these are all things that have been talked about through various studies, and I'm sure in many of your conversations. It takes, and this is in no order of priority, but they're all connected. At the center of that, at the center is that people have trusted personal networks around them. They have people in their lives who know them, care for them, who are there for them. And this is people in a relationship of personal knowledge. They know the person, trust and commitment to the person. That's what keeps people safe. And the fact that you have growing levels of loneliness and social isolation and increasing rates of abuse, neglect, and crimes against seniors, those two things are connected. When people are alone, lonely, isolated, they don't have people in their lives, they're more vulnerable. Individualized funding has been another piece, and that's been identified, and that goes with having needs for home and disability-related supports met. How we get our support matters, if we've got control over it or not. And individualized funding, so people get the funds for disability-related and home supports themselves, so that they can make decisions about who's going to provide that care, when and how and where, has been shown to be really critically important to their well-being, including reducing hospital stays, emergency admissions, admission to long-term care, etc. Because we also know people want, and they express this, want to age in place in their homes, in their community. But they often have to leave because they can't get the home support and disability-related supports that are flexible and adaptive and responsive to their needs. And individualized funding is a key way to do that. Navigation and administrative assistance are part of that picture. If I need support, I need some help to help. I need some help to put that package of support I need together. I may also need some admin assistance to help me manage those funds, to help me manage the various agreements that I need in order that I can age in place to the greatest extent possible. And then legal capacity and the right to decide is a critical piece, excuse me, of the puzzle. Because if I'm going to have a funding package from the government, if I'm going to engage and contract providers to provide me support, if I'm going to be making decisions with my navigator about where I'm going to live and how and who's going to support me, I'm entering all kinds of agreements. I'm making all kinds of decisions that have legal consequences. And if I don't have legal capacity, if I'm not recognized to be a legal agent, I can't enter those contracts and agreements, and that leaves me powerless. And that takes us right back full circle to trusted personal networks and people in my life, because one of the big, what makes, what keeps us safe, what gives us the power to make decisions when we need support, is that we have people in our lives. And that's ultimately what supported decision making is all about. It's having people around me who can assist me in figuring out what's important to me, what I want, and then assisting me in making the necessary legal arrangements to put that into effect. So there's lots of conversations going on in the province about all of these pieces, but important to keep in mind that they connect. At the center of this is people's well-being. But we're going to look today, if this can, there we go. We're going to look at the legal capacity piece of the puzzle. And so what's the problem that we're trying to solve? The problem is that there's many seniors and people with intellectual developmental, cognitive, mental health disabilities who are losing their right to decide through forms of guardianship, through involuntary committal in psychiatric wards, through substitute decision-making in long-term care and residential facilities. There's a myriad of ways in which people lose their right to decide. And sometimes it's informal, where they're being supported by, they're either in a long-term care facility or a residential care home or even in the community, and they don't have people around them who are supporting them to make decisions. They don't have power over those arrangements or agreements in long-term care. They don't have the power to decide. And so people are under chemical restraints. Others are deciding for them, even if they don't formally have, aren't formally under guardianship. Now, if people are in long-term care facilities, that's usually because there is a power of attorney or some sort of arrangement in which those healthcare, so-called healthcare decisions are being made for them. But there's a multiple ways in which people lose power over their lives. So what's the legal framework? What are these legal capacity laws? What are they? What do they do? So at the root of these laws, and we're going to talk about these more in a sec, they determine whether a person can make decisions for themselves, if they need support to do that, and when someone else will be required to make decisions for them. And usually the capacity to do that is equated with mental or cognitive capacity. And the laws that regulate the right to decide establish the legal criteria for that purpose. And if a person doesn't meet those criteria, the law allows for someone else to make decisions for them. So basically, this legal framework determines when someone has the right to make choices and when that power will be taken away. So the mainstream approach that dominates is, and this dominates in law, but it also dominates in, I think, our kind of just in our public consciousness. It dominates in the ways that service providers look at and interact with and engage with a person. There's this idea that what makes us a person able to decide and exercise control over our lives is that we understand and appreciate. We understand information relevant to a decision, whether it's a healthcare decision or it's a financial decision at the bank, if it's a personal life decision about where we're going to live and who's going to support us, that we understand information that's relevant to that decision, and we appreciate the reasonably foreseeable consequences. That's the kind of legal term of whether we're going to take this or that medication, or we're going to go with the proposed intervention by our healthcare provider. And so if we don't meet that test, understanding and appreciation, then that's the basis on which a physician may say, Michael is not able to give informed consent, and so we need somebody else to do this for him. So that's the kind of, that's that assumption that what makes us a person able to exercise legal power in our lives is that we can understand and understand information relevant to the decision and appreciate the consequences. And that we can then express a decision in ways that others understand. So the cluster of laws in Newfoundland and Labrador that are regulating this are the Adult Protection Act, the Advanced Healthcare Directives Act, the Enduring Powers of Attorney Act, Mentally Disabled Persons Estates Act, and the Mental Health Care and Treatment Act. All of these laws set up that test of capacity. And if a person can't demonstrate that they can fully understand and appreciate consequences, that's and so, for instance, they may be in a situation where there's concern about abuse or neglect. That gives the Office of Adult Protection the authority to go in and explore what's going on and consider taking steps, which can include removing the person's right to legal capacity and taking authority over decision making. The Advanced Healthcare Directives Act provides for a person to make an advanced directive about who's going to support them. So it's an important planning tool in that. That act provides an important planning tool. I can appoint someone to make healthcare decisions for me if I'm not able to. But the act also provides that in a healthcare facility, the physician can override the advance directive that I've made if they decide that another decision is made, or the person acting for me is not making the right decision. So it gives me some power, but I can quickly lose that power. The Enduring Powers of Attorney Act provides me the opportunity to appoint someone to make decisions and to support my decision making on my behalf in personal care, healthcare, financial decisions. And so it's an exercise of my autonomy, if you will, by deciding that my brother or my wife is going to play this role for me when I'm not able to make decisions on my own. But we also know that one of the big concerns that people have expressed is that powers of attorney are not being fully guided by the person. There's all kinds of abuse and neglect that's going on under those arrangements as well. The Mentally Disabled Persons Estates Act provides for guardians to be appointed for people who are determined to be mentally disabled under the act, have an intellectual disability, or not able to make financial decisions on their own. And the Mental Health Care and Treatment Act, as you know, will provide for people to be admitted and treated involuntarily if they don't, again, have that capacity to understand and appreciate. So there's a whole, and there's many more, but those are the kind of core in Newfoundland and Labrador. This approach has been found to be discriminatory on the basis of disability. It's been found discriminatory under the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. An analysis has been done also of the equality rights. Lana's done a very important analysis of whether this test of capacity violates people's right to equality under the Charter, and concludes that it does. The convention and the UN committee that monitors the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which Canada has signed and ratified, requires that governments instead recognize that people may need support in decision making. And but it isn't very clear about what that support looks like. And so that's a big piece of the work that we have to do. And that was a big piece of the work in the Roadmap for Reform study that we did a few years ago. So the big shift that's happened is that test of capacity that we've just talked about, that you find in laws across the province, is discriminatory. It violates people's rights because it says, if you have essentially, it violates people's rights on the basis of their cognitive or intellectual or developmental disability. People who by definition are going to have trouble fully understanding and appreciating information and consequences and communicating those to others. And basically the convention says, but that's a human condition, and that's no reason to remove legal power and agency from a person. So what must this framework do? What must our legal framework do to ensure that people in fact have equality? The first step is to adopt what we refer to as the decision-making capability approach to legal capacity, rather than that cognitive-based approach that I just outlined. And that, this approach to legal capacity starts in a different place than the cognitive approach, or the approaches that say if you're diagnosed as having a developmental disability, by definition, you're not able to make decisions on your own. And you see that reflected to some extent in the Mentally Disabled Persons Estates Act. So the decision-making capability approach starts in a different place. And the UN Convention, it's Article 12 in the Convention, starts in this place as well. And it says that legal capacity, first and foremost, is about the ability to express your will and preferences. And if I can express what's important to me, and this comes back to that trusted network of people around me that I referred to earlier. If I've got people in my life who can understand and interpret that and communicate it as a basis for healthcare and other decisions, that's what can give me legal capacity. So and my will is not a cognitive act, right? Our will is bred into us. It comes to us through our culture, our environment, our experiences, our opportunities. And regardless of how significant, or what some might say, a profound intellectual or developmental or cognitive disability I might have, there are things that matter to me. And we have all kinds of accounts from people, loved ones, parents, excuse me, people around this session and elsewhere, who can attest to that. Their loved ones have things that matter to them. Their loved ones have values, things that they value. And people can be guided by those, that will, by those preferences, by those intentions of people that they're supporting. So this approach, the decision-making capability approach, recognizes that the other steps in decision-making, so understanding information, appreciating consequences, figuring out what a person's will, or what needs to be done to give effect to a person's will in the circumstances, can be carried out by others who can bring understanding and appreciation to the table. So what makes us human, what makes us, what gives purpose to our lives, is not the extent of our cognitive abilities. What gives purpose is that my will, my values, the things that matter to me, are seen and recognized by others. And that's what gives me place, a place in the community. That's what makes me uniquely who I am. so the other steps, the gathering and understanding information, the weighing and appreciating consequences, the communicating a choice, carrying out needed steps to put a decision into action, those can be carried out by others to a greater or lesser extent, depending on the changing nature of my developmental, cognitive, mental health disability. And that's effectively what supported decision-making is. It starts with this core idea that what makes us human, what makes us a legal agent in the world, is that I have a will and preferences, something that matters to me. And that I have around me trusted others who can, depending on the situation, carry out, excuse me, these other needed steps. So this approach recognizes that there's two ways to exercise legal capacity. I can do it independently, and right now I'm able to, in a legal sense, make decisions independently. I can go to the doctor's office this afternoon, and I'll be able to communicate in a way that the physician can be confident that I can give consent to this or that treatment if I was to need that. And so we want to protect that. People, and I've heard from people, with intellectual disabilities for years who say, don't impose supported decision-making on me, which would be putting a network of people around me who I need to have in the room in order to make a decision. If I don't need it, respect my right and ability to make decisions independently. And that may mean I need a little more time in the doctor's office. It may mean I need some plain language assistance. It may, for some people, it may mean I need a communication intermediary using a communication board. But I can make this decision by myself. There will be others, and all of us, possibly at some point in our lives, who may not have those cognitive abilities and communicative abilities, which are necessary for legally valid decisions, right? Like a contract, in order to make and fulfill a contract, it's important that there is understanding and appreciation and commitment to fulfilling that contract. So it doesn't mean that these other pieces of the decision-making process aren't critical and important. It just means that I shouldn't have to be required to carry them out on myself, but all by myself. So the other approach is an interdependent approach to decision-making, which and this is what is usually associated with supported decision-making. So that together the person and their recognized decision-making supporters have the capacity to carry out all those steps in decision-making, which are guided by and informed by my will and preferences, by my values, by those things that matter to me most. So what we're calling for, or what we need in the legal framework, is to shift from this cognitive test of capacity to this decision-making capability approach, which recognizes that I can make decisions interdependently with others who are committed to being guided by my will and preferences. So this decision-making capability alternative recognizes that we all have unique abilities to express our will and preferences and unique cognitive abilities, and these are likely going to adapt and shift over time. But we add supports to those, which could be a communication board, which could be the support of a supported decision-making network if I'm going to make decisions interdependently. The accommodations, so the accommodations of the physician who is should be taking more time if I need that, or who is going to communicate with me in plainer language. And it also requires that I have legal status to be able to make decisions interdependently. And right now, people don't have legal status in Newfoundland and Labrador to make decisions interdependently. They do have that. There have been recent changes in the law in New Brunswick. So we've got New Brunswick and British Columbia are the only jurisdictions in Canada which recognize supported decision making in that sense. That is the power to make decisions interdependently, and that also my supporters have legal status, so that if I need to change my address with Canada Revenue Agency, currently the situation in Newfoundland is, and this can happen in various parts of the country, that can trigger guardianship, because the agent at CRA will say, well, sorry, you need to put Michael on the phone. And if my partner or brother, mother, son says, oh, sorry, you won't be able to understand or communicate with them, they say, well, then you're not, unless you're his legally appointed agent and have legal, and you have the legal capacity to do this, we can't make any changes. And so we need to give legal status to my supporters in order to be able to communicate and get information on my behalf with other parties in order to give effect to my decision making. So we need the law also to recognize that. So how those supporters get appointed, on what basis, how disputes get handled, all of those become legal questions that need to be resolved. And there's various proposals out there for doing that. But you put all those pieces together, and that's what gives us decision-making capability. That's what is a much more inclusive approach to giving people power, choice, power, and control in their lives. The other thing that we need in the legal framework is to recognize decision-making supports and supported decision-making arrangements. So, there can be a range of supports, as I've said, helping a person, develop a plan for what's important to them, how they're going to, the decisions that are important and how those are going to be met. Developing relationships of support, communication assistance, decision-making supporters, interpretive support. That's a key support that decision-making supporters in supported decision-making provide. That interpretive support of interpreting how I express my will and preferences and communicating to the physician what that means in the circumstances. Michael's in pain. He wants to get rid of that pain. That's what we need to deal with. That's what's most important. What's the best way to do it? And my supporters are going to understand, or may, because they've had experience with me over time, what medications are going to work or not work, what's needed to help me, get calm or deal with what has been a difficult situation, a similarly difficult situation in the past. So supported decision-making arrangements are legally recognized supporter or group of supporters who provide interpretive support and representation where a person is acting legally interdependently. They're not able to act independently in ways we've talked about. A third thing that we need this framework to do is to recognize that physicians and others have a duty to accommodate in decision-making. And the UN Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities defines that as any adjustment or modification that needs to be made in the decision-making process. A fourth element that's needed is to ensure that there's a range of planning tools. We need powers of attorney, and as a last resort, there will likely be some form of substitute decision-making or guardianship. But it's in between that we need other kinds of tools like supported decision-making arrangements that people can create, people can appoint. So this would include me being able to appoint my decision-making supporter at some point in the future, or if I'm not able to make that appointment or not seen as being able to make that appointment legally independently, some process by which my wife, my son, my mother, brother, or a group of friends can apply to be recognized as those legal supporters in decision making, and also to better balance the right to equality, the right in making decisions, and the freedom from harm, because we're talking about a group of people who are vulnerable to abuse and neglect by others, and it's happening as we know. But we haven't struck the balance, I think, correctly, whether we're talking in an adult protection context or in a mental health context. and we need to ask, have we taken all reasonable efforts to create the decision-making supports that a person needs? And that even, after all of those steps, a person's unable to act legally independently or interdependently, and a decision is needed to address a situation of serious adverse effects to the person or harm to the person or others. And it's at that point, only after those steps, unless it's an emergency, and then a decision needs to be made. And there you're likely, you have to be guided by this principle of the best interpretation. Like, what do we know, even in the healthcare emergency context? If a person has made clear that they don't want a certain intervention, then even in an emergency context, you can't proceed with that. So at this limit point, after you've tried everything, this approach would say that the safeguards must include that you still take every proactive step that's possible to create the decision-making capability of a person, which may include having supporters around the person, that you allow for restricting a person's legal capacity, their power to make decisions, only after all reasonable efforts are put in place to arrange decision-making supports. And it's only then that you can intervene to restrict a person's legal capacity. So this most recent study we've done is looked at, well, so how are we doing? How are we doing in different jurisdictions on making sure those five main kind of elements are in the legal framework? And we looked specifically at provisions in legal capacity laws in Newfoundland and Labrador and elsewhere. Those statutes that I referred to earlier. And we asked, so to what extent is this inclusive approach to legal capacity that I've just outlined that recognizes supported decision-making, to what extent is that embedded in the law? Does the law recognize and policy recognize the full range of decision-making supports that a person may need, that from planning facilitation to providing for supported decision-making? Does the law provide for supported decision-making arrangements for me to be able to appoint supporters, or if I don't have the cognitive abilities to for others to apply to be appointed as my supporters on my behalf? Is there a government obligation to ensure access to decision-making supports? Because being able to make or guide decisions about my healthcare, about my autonomy, my personal life, is fundamental to being recognized as a full human being, a full citizen with deserving of the dignity and respect of others. So decision-making supports, we should have a right to decision-making supports, just like we have a right to healthcare. So to what extent does the current framework, provide for a government obligation to ensure access to those supports? Also looked at, to what extent does this legal framework, just as I was talking about balancing the right to equality and ensuring safeguards, is there a mandatory exploration of support alternatives at all of those points where my legal capacity or right to decide can be taken away from me? When I go to a bank and a banker doesn't think that I have the capacity to make a decision about or transfer funds from this estate that I've just received from my mother, or to withdraw funds from my account, or when I go, if I'm in a mental health crisis and I go to an emergency ward, and does the bank, does the emergency department, the physician, are they required to take the steps to explore decision-making support alternatives before they impose substitute decision-making on me? So we really looked at, to what extent is that mandatory exploration of decision support alternatives in place? And then finally, to what extent is there a recognized duty to accommodate me in decision-making processes in the ways that I've talked about? So when we looked at it across the country, you'll see there, so no, in no jurisdiction, there were 4 scores for the various provisions across, we looked at 560 some legal provisions in laws and policies across the country, and scored them as they fully meet those tests that I've just laid out. They mostly meet them, they partly meet them, or they don't meet them at all. So purple is that the provisions don't meet them at all. So at the federal level, none of the provisions regulating legal capacity meet the test for an inclusive model. And then there, across the provinces and territories, the mix of provisions, it varies. So in Newfoundland and Labrador, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 from the left, you'll see that most of the provisions don't meet the test of an inclusive model at all. There are a couple that mostly meet it, and that's in the Enduring Powers of Attorney Act. It does provide for appointing a designated representative to assist in one area of decision making, which is an RDSP. And there's a few that partly meet, that begin to recognize support in decision making. So, for instance, the principles in the Adult Protection Act recognize that a person may need support for decision making. So there are beginnings of recognition, but nowhere near a framework that is based on this inclusive approach to legal capacity, independent and interdependent decision making, recognizing decision making supports, supported decision making arrangements, government obligation to ensure access, mandatory exploration, and duty to accommodate. So nowhere near the provisions that are needed to ensure that those conditions are in place so that people can, in fact, exercise choice, power, and control in their lives and have access to supported decision making, which is a really simple notion. And people around the table, I know from my experience in Newfoundland and Labrador over many, many years, it's in practice. What we're really calling for is the law to catch up with the practice of supported decision making, and not to force people into substitute decision making arrangements, as is currently the case. So I think in conclusion, legal capacity regimes have to comply with the equality right in the Charter, and they're not currently. The statutory provisions in Newfoundland and Labrador's framework appear to violate the Charter as well as the UN CRPD, and to ensure equality and inclusion, this decision-making capability approach to legal capacity that I've laid out here needs to be implemented. So, as I conclude here, that I guess the question is the time ripe for a big leap forward? Are the stars aligning? And I think there's those of you, in Newfoundland and Labrador will have a sense of this better than I. But, we do know that provincial governments looking at various reports and consultations, the Deloitte report on home supports, there's been some efforts at putting an individualized funding and navigation system in place. We understand that Cabinet has endorsed in some way our recommendations out of the report, the study we did on supported decision-making, a roadmap for reform. And we also know that related to that, we understand the provincial government launched this consultation in December, or November, actually, I guess, shortly after the symposium that was convened end of October on developing a framework for supporting adult decision making. And that consultation concluded in December, and we understand, or my understanding is that's inside, and whether they'll produce now a what we heard report, or what the next steps aren't entirely clear. But I'll leave it there, Mary, and